Okay, ready to dive deep? Today it's genotypes and phenotypes. And I think even for a philosopher, this is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, you know what I think is so interesting about this topic is just how much, like even the definitions of genotype and phenotype, how much those have changed over time.
So let's go all the way back to 1911 when Wilhelm Johansen first used these terms.
Yeah.
And I think what's surprising is how different his understanding of these concepts was from how we think of them today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Back then, he was really grappling with this problem of, how do we make heredity a truly experimental science? How
Yeah.
do we move beyond description and like really get into what's happening?
Like, stop just talking about what we see and actually, like, poke around and figure out what's going on.
Exactly. And you know what's so wild is his experimental subject, he used inbred beans.
Beans.
Yeah.
Not exactly the most glamorous scientific subject, right?
No, but really, really useful for what he was trying to do.
Oh.
So just imagine using these beans to demonstrate that like characteristics acquired during a plant's life.
Aren't passed on to its offspring.
Okay, so if a bean plant gets taller because it's in a sunny spot, it doesn't mean that its seeds are going to automatically make tall plants.
Yeah, that's exactly what he was showing. And this is a huge distinction he was trying to make
Wow.
between the sort of like fundamental blueprint of an organism
Yeah.
and the traits that it actually ends up having.
So how did Johansen actually define genotype and phenotype back then?
Okay, so he used phenotype to describe like a class of organisms that could be distinguished by their outward characteristics.
Okay.
So imagine grouping organisms based only on what you can see, and then on the other hand, genotype referred to like the class of organisms sharing the same fundamental blueprint for development.
So it's like the phenotype is the book cover,
Yes,
and the genotype is the actual story inside.
that's a perfect way to put it. The cover gives you a hint of what the story might be about,
Yeah.
but it doesn't reveal the whole plot.
Right.
And in the same way, an organism's phenotype gives you clues about its genetic makeup.
But the genotype holds the complete blueprint.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, from like a philosophical standpoint.
Yeah.
Because Johansen was working at a time when Gregor Mendel's groundbreaking pea experiments were really starting to make waves
Oh,
in
yeah.
the scientific community.
Absolutely. Those pea experiments were just so carefully controlled,
Yeah.
with the crosses in the environments.
Mendel's pea experiments, those were all about dominant and recessive traits,
Yeah,
right? Like purple flowers being dominant over white flowers.
exactly. And so by controlling which plants reproduced, he could predict what characteristics their offspring would have.
Right.
And this allowed him to infer these underlying factors that were being passed down.
And we now call those genes.
Exactly. Genes.
So how did Mendel's findings reshape our understanding of genotypes and phenotypes?
It really took it to another level.
Yeah.
Because remember, Mendel was all about meticulously controlling both the crosses and the environments. And that meant that he could actually map between a phenotype and a genotype much more precisely. It wasn't just about observing traits anymore. It was about understanding the specific factors that contributed to those traits.
So Mendel gave us a way to actually look beneath the surface
Yes.
and kind of see the genetic puppet master pulling the strings.
Yes. And this is where the concept of genotype really starts to resemble how we think of it today.
Okay.
It's the actual genetic makeup,
Okay.
particularly the genes involved in a trait.
But it's not always so straightforward, is it?
Oh, it's rarely so straightforward.
Right.
It's much more complicated than that.
So what kind of things make it more complicated than just the simple one gene, one trait?
Well, there's lots of things, so many things.
Likewise.
For one, there's this thing called epistasis,
Okay.
where basically the effects of one gene can be masked or modified by another gene.
Huh.
So it's not just like these individual genes acting in isolation.
Right.
It's about how they interact.
So it's like a whole orchestra where the final sound depends not only on each instrument, but also how they all kind of work together.
Exactly. It's a symphony of genes, and that's what makes it even harder to trace the path
Oh, I bet.
from like one specific gene to a trait.
Yeah. Are there other things that complicate it
Oh, yeah,
besides that?
absolutely.
Okay.
Well, there's this thing called expressivity.
Okay.
And this is where the same genotype can result in a range of phenotypic expressions.
So even if you have like the same genes, you might not express the same traits in exactly the same way.
Yeah. It's like having the potential for something,
Yeah.
but not a guarantee.
Right.
And then there's penetrance,
Okay.
which is the probability that a genotype will even be expressed as a phenotype.
So like you might carry the gene for something,
Yeah.
But there's no guarantee that it'll actually show up.
It's like rolling the dice, you know,
It's like a genetic gamble.
it is a genetic gamble.
Wow.
And there's incomplete dominance, where neither gene is fully dominant over the other, and you get like a blending of traits.
Oh, so like a pink flower.
A pink flower, yeah, exactly.
Coming from a red and white parent.
Yeah, you know, like mixing colors.
Oh.
Sometimes you get a whole new shade instead of one taking over.
Wow.
So yeah, lots of things that make it complicated.
So it sounds like the relationship between genotype and phenotype, it's not like a straightforward instruction manual. It's more like a complex recipe
Yeah.
with a lot of different factors that can affect the outcome.
It's like a recipe with a lot of hidden steps, you know, and secret ingredients.
And how do scientists even begin to understand something so complex?
Well, a big part of it has been through the controlled experiment.
Okay.
By really carefully manipulating, you know, the conditions where organisms live and reproduce, scientists can tease apart these influences
Right.
of genotype and environment.
So it's kind of like creating a simplified model to figure out the basic rules of the game.
It is, but it's important to remember that the lab is only one piece of the puzzle.
Right, because in the real world, it's a lot messier.
It is,
Yeah.
in a lab. And as scientists started to study more complex traits like height or weight or behavior, these things are influenced by multiple genes and lots of environmental factors.
Yeah.
And they realized that these simple Mendelian models that worked so well for single gene traits, they just weren't cutting it.
Okay. So like the one gene, one trait idea that wasn't really accurate.
No, it wasn't that simple. Most traits are influenced by lots of genes interacting with each other and with the environment.
So they needed some new tools to figure this out.
They did, and this led to fields like quantitative genetics, which uses statistical models to study the inheritance of traits.
In populations.
In populations, yeah.
Okay, so quantitative genetics, that sounds complicated.
It can be, but at its core, it's really about embracing the messiness instead of isolating the effects of individual genes.
Right.
Quantitative genetics looks at the overall variation in a trait within a population.
And tries to see, how much of that is due to genes versus environment?
So it's like shifting from looking at genes under a microscope to looking at the whole landscape of how genes work in the real world.
Exactly, a much broader view.
Wow.
And this has been really valuable for understanding traits that are influenced by many genes. All acting together.
And it kind of challenges this idea that our genes are our destiny.
It does. It's this idea called genetic determinism.
Right. Like it controls everything about us.
Yeah. But quantitative genetics shows us that most traits aren't simply caused by our genes. They're the result of this complex interaction between our genes and our environment.
It's that nature versus nurture thing again.
It is, but it's not a versus.
Right.
It's an interplay.
It's a dance.
It is a dance.
It's a constant dance between the two.
And this takes us back to epigenetics.
Oh, yeah. Epigenetics.
Which adds a whole other layer to this whole genotype-phenotype relationship, right? Because epigenetics is about how environmental factors can actually change how genes are expressed. Right? Like it's almost like a volume knob for each gene.
Exactly. You know, turning it up or down depending on what's going on around you.
So our experiences can change how our genes work.
They can.
Wow.
It's not a one-way street anymore, you know.
It's like a two-way conversation between our genes and our environment.
Exactly. A constant dialogue back and forth.
We've come a long way from those beans and peas, haven't we?
We have.
This is incredible.
And we're still learning so much.
I bet. So we've talked about the science, but I think what's even more interesting is like, what does this all mean? You know, what are the implications of this distinction?
Right. Like, what does it tell us about life itself?
Exactly. Especially for like a philosopher.
Yeah. You know, one of the key takeaways, I think, is this idea that there's a barrier between what's inherited across generations and the traits that an organism develops during its lifetime.
So like, no matter how much I learn in my lifetime, I can't genetically pass on that knowledge to my kids.
Yeah, that's the classic idea.
Right.
That acquired characteristics aren't inherited.
And that was a really radical idea back then.
Oh, yeah. Completely changed the way people thought about heredity.
But epigenetics has kind of complicated that, hasn't it?
It has. It's shown us that the barrier between genotype and phenotype isn't as solid as we once thought.
Right. It's a much more dynamic relationship.
Yeah, it's like this ongoing conversation.
So how much of who we are is really determined by our genes?
That's the big question, isn't it?
And how much is shaped by our environment?
nature versus nurture.
That age-old debate.
Yeah, but now we have this much more nuanced understanding of how these forces interact.
Right, because it's not like there's a single gene for intelligence
No.
or a single gene for being good at art.
Exactly.
So it's more than just our genes, right?
It is, our genes give us this potential, a set of possibilities.
Yeah.
But it's our environment, our experiences,
The choices we make,
our actions.
all of that,
Okay.
that shapes how those possibilities actually play out.
So we're not just puppets of our genes.
No, we have agency.
Yeah, okay.
We can make choices.
That's a huge idea.
It is. And I think understanding this distinction,
Yeah.
it gives us power.
Okay.
The power to make informed decisions
About our health and our lives.
about the world we want to create.
Wow. This is going way beyond just biology now.
It is. It's about what it means to be human.
And what about evolution?
Yes.
How does this all fit into that?
Well, the traditional view of evolution.
Survival of the fittest.
Right. It's about selection acting on phenotypes.
On the traits that organisms actually have.
Yeah, the ones that help them survive and reproduce.
And those traits get passed down.
Right. But the genotype-phenotype distinction,
Yeah.
it adds another layer to this.
Okay.
It tells us that evolution isn't just about selecting for good traits.
It's not.
It's about selecting for genotypes that have the potential
The potential.
to produce those traits
Okay.
under certain environmental conditions.
So it's not just the trait itself, but the potential to have that trait.
Yeah, and that potential can be influenced by so many things.
Like what?
Mutations,
Okay.
the shuffling of genes during reproduction.
Right.
It's a complex dance between chance and selection.
Wow. Evolution is way more complex than I thought.
It really is.
So what's the big takeaway here? What should we be thinking about?
I think the most important thing is to remember that the genotype-phenotype distinction isn't just a scientific concept.
Okay.
It's a way of looking at the world.
a lens through which we can understand life.
Exactly. It helps us understand how our genes and our environment work together
To make us who we are.
to create the incredible diversity of life that we see.
And it raises some pretty big philosophical questions, too.
It does questions about what it means to be human,
About free will and determinism.
about the nature of identity.
It's a lot to think about.
It is, but that's the beauty of it.
I know this deep dive has really made me think about how nature and nurture work together
Yeah,
to make each of us unique.
that's an amazing thing.
It really is. Well, I think that's about all the time we have for today.
Yeah.
But we'll leave you with one last thought.
Okay.
If our environment can actually change our genes, what does that mean for the future of evolution?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Could we direct our own evolution?
It's a question for the philosophers.
And the scientists.
Yeah, for all of us to ponder.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world around us.